Hello, and welcome to another of our BMS Explainer videos. In this video, we are going to be looking at BGPO SI-007-01 Vendor Risk Categorisation. This is the first of the instructions that support SP007 Vendor Management. To simplify the process and ensure that it is as effective as possible, we have split BGPO into different business units. This is because each business unit can have different vendors and very different risks. Business units are required to form a vendor management team, made up of representatives of each department at business unit level and at HQ level. The first task for these vendor management teams, or VMTs, to identify all the types of vendors that will be used by their own business unit and record these in the form BGPO SF-007-01, column B. Each business unit will have a different list of vendors. Here are some examples of the types of vendors that we use: node suppliers, training providers, waste contractors, manning agencies, legal consultants, medical services, and many more. Then, for each vendor type, add the position that is typically the contract holder. If for any reason this is not practical, just leave it blank. The next stage is for the VTM to go through the list of vendor types and list all the risks associated with that type of vendor. Remember, we are not only talking about health and safety risks. We also need to consider financial risks, reputational risks, legal compliance risk, and more. We need to look at each vendor type and document exactly what risks they bring to BGP Offshore when they work for us. For example, when we hire a vessel, what do we need to think about? Is it seaworthy? Is the company financially stable? Does it have the necessary certifications to operate? Are the crew competent? Is there a planned maintenance program working effectively for the vessel? If we hire medics from an agency, what do we need to understand about their business that can affect our company? Is the agency licensed? Is there a process for checking the medics are properly qualified? Do they have a process for monitoring the expiry of certificates, etc.? Once we have identified all of the generic risks of our vendors, we need to evaluate the risks and categorize them according to the risk they present to BGP Offshore. We categorize our vendors so that we know what controls we are going to look for before we allocate any work to them. Now let's look at how we evaluate the vendor risk. The vendor mode axis refers to IOGP 423 HSE management, guidelines for working together in a contract environment, contract mode, and identifies and describes the relationship between BGPO and the vendor regarding how and by whose management system risk is managed. The full text of this guideline can be found either in the IOGP document or in the annex to BGPO SI-007-01 Vendor Risk Categorisation. The vertical axis is a measure of how the vendor's failure will impact BGP Offshore. We have to ask ourselves, what happens to our project if this vendor fails? Does the vendor's failure put anyone in danger? Could it be harmful to the environment? Will the project stop? Be delayed? Cost us time? Cost us money? This process should be as objective as possible using an evidence-based approach, which means that we should look at the history of vendor types in the industry and more generally, and any personal experience of the vendor management team or the subject matter experts called in to assist. In column F of the Vendor Risk Level Assessment Form, that is BGPO SF-007-01, the vendor management team will decide what risk controls are required to be in place so that we can ensure that any potential vendor has these risk controls in place. Some examples. There's a risk that a vendor vessel breaks down because of lack of maintenance. So we need to check there is an effective planned maintenance program in place. In another example, there's a risk that some personnel from their manning agency do not possess legitimate professional certificates. we need to ensure that the vendor has appropriate process for checking and monitoring certificates and qualification. And so we continue until we have gone through this process for each type of vendor. The penultimate part of our vendor risk level assessment will detail the who should be on the vendor management team for specific vendor types. For example, if we are hiring doctors, we probably don't need the technical department to be part of the vendor management. If we are buying seismic equipment, we probably don't require the QHSSE department to be part of the process. We don't need all departments to be represented for all types of vendors, so decide who does need to be there. And that is the vendor risk categorization process, almost complete. The final step is to ensure that the vendor categories are reviewed annually, or if there are significant changes in risk from vendors. You have now completed the first part of the vendor management process. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. In the next explainer video, we'll look at how we use these vendor categories to ensure that we reduce the risk to BGP offshore when using vendors as detailed in the document BGPO SI-007-01 Vendor Qualification. Thanks for watching!